What you're about to hear is a conversation that I hosted between Chris Cutrone and Nina Power last week. This is a fantastic conversation. I'm really excited to share it with you. But before I play it, I just have to say, Chris Cutrone is teaching a course, Intro to Marxism, throughout the month of October 2024 here at Theory Underground. Theory Underground subscribers get half off. If you're interested in the subscriptions, or becoming a member, or really just what is Theory Underground, stick around until the end of the video. Watch the PSA that I've made at the end. It's a great way to get a sense for what we're all about. But for now, the short version is this. Theory Underground is not just a YouTube. It's not just a podcast. It is a lecture course, research seminar, and book publishing platform. Yeah, it's a lot of things. And most of that people don't even see on the YouTube or podcast. But, you know, this is the marketing arm of TU, and it's where I like to host interesting conversations and get to know fascinating people. And bringing together Chris and Nina here is by far one of my favorite things that I've done this year. I'm very excited to have introduced them. And, yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So enjoy. Welcome to Theory Underground. We've got Nina Power and Chris Cutrone here. How's it going, you two?
Good.
Great, Dave.
Great. Great to have you both. I'd like to say a few introductory remarks. First of all, for friends of the channel or people who've been following us for a while, neither of these guests are strangers to you. You should be very familiar with both of them at this point. But for anybody dropping in on the for the first time, or let's just say someone who knows one but not the other, I'll just say a couple things. And the topic or theme of this conversation is neither left or right, right? Neither left or right. And it is the theme that I thought I really wanted to bring up with the two of you, because in our own ways, it has come up one-on-one before. In particular with you, Chris, back in the day, I think when I was pretending to be Benedict Cryptofash, or kind of hold what I took to be his position in a conversation, you said that neither left or right always kind of just turns into right? And then with Nina, I think that I've heard you say things about how we should strive to be neither left or right, or something kind of along those lines. And so I want to give you an opportunity to each kind of clarify what you take to be the position where you're at right now. But first, Nina Power lives in London, recently became jobless and was bankrupted because, someone has spent a lot of money to make sure that happened. That's the short version. For the long version, we have a video that went up on the channel very recently. And so anybody who wants to sort of see the anatomy of the witch hunt, go ahead and check that out there. And then Chris is currently working on a documentary about the Democratic and Republican national conventions with Doug Lane from Sublation. And so I'm very excited about your projects and the kinds of things that you're both working on. And for anybody who's feeling politically homeless, or who feels like there's something wrong with the left, you're probably at least familiar with one of these two figures here. And so I think we're going to start out with Chris. What would you like to add on to that introduction?
All right, I guess the first thing I would clarify is the conventional uses of left and right. From my perspective, as a Marxist with a kind of long historical view, I think of it as like progressive and conservative capitalist politics. So the left usually means progressive capitalism, the right usually means conservative capitalism. And of course, in that respect, I would be neither left nor right. However, there is an older definition in two senses of left and right. One famously going back to the French Revolution, referring to the First Republic and the role of the Jacobins in that revolutionary process. And then later, the Jacobins represented, something more democratic, more radical in terms of republicanism. Later, the terms left and right applied within the Marxist movement itself. And there are a couple of moments of that. There's the crisis of Marxism in the Second International, and that leading on into the split between communists and social democrats or socialists around the Russian Revolution, in which the communists were the left. You know, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, the founders of the Third International were the left. And then finally, there's the left opposition to Stalinism. And I think these are important things to remember and to uphold, even if it's not entirely clear what relevance that history has for us today. Right? To just at least pose the question, what did it mean for there to be a left wing of Marxism? What did it mean for there to be a right wing of Marxism? What did it mean for there to be left wing socialists and right wing socialists? You know, and then later, again, left opposition in the Communist International, left oppositional communists versus right wing communists or Stalinists. Right. So, what all of that might mean, I think, is worth keeping in mind. It may not be extremely politically relevant, but I think there's something worth holding on to there intellectually.
And so on this distinction, I want to come back and I'll have a question for you about that political relevance of the questions that you're posing and this sort of older sense of the term left. But let's bring it over to Nina now. Nina, as far as that introduction goes, what would you like to add?
Yeah, sure. First of all, just to say, it's nice to be here and nice to speak to Chris. People I respect speak very highly of Chris. Someone reminded me that I signed a letter against platypus about 9 million years ago, which I'd completely forgotten about.
You
I'm
did.
so
A lot
sorry.
of people did.
I actually asked to have my name removed from this letter, but I doubt my request was heeded. I would not. I mean, this doesn't make me sound great, I must admit, but I wouldn't have had any idea what the letter was about, nor would I have done any of my own research at the time. I imagine I was asked to sign it by one of the bloggers at that point, or somebody like that, or they might have just said,
someone you trusted.
Yes, exactly. Someone I trusted. Probably someone said, "Can I add your name?" And I just said, "Yeah, whatever." You know. Anyway, there's a lesson there for all of us. But you know, I don't mind open letters if they're signed by people, and you know. But I think we should probably have more. You know, do our own research. You know, I think I've learned. Well, indeed, and I think you know the amount of craziness and hysteria and people's pet projects that are involved in these things that I just trusted people and I shouldn't have done. But there you go.
I never sign anything for that reason.
Yes.
I'll always disagree.
Fair enough. You know, I mean, there probably are some things worth signing, but yes,
sure,
then in that case, everyone should read them. Anyway, so the question of neither left nor right. Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of deeper question here, which is maybe goes beyond politics, and I wonder whether we might get onto this question of to what extent we should be interested in politics at all. I mean, I feel like a lot of the time I'm trying to run away from politics, especially as it's understood today, and the demand that everyone be understood politically to something, you know, more philosophical. But I would say if we want to talk about this as a metaphysical question or even a cosmic question, I would understand left and right as, on the one hand, a kind of relation to sort of well, first of all, to equality on the one hand, and then on the right, on the other hand, as an understanding of hierarchy. But even deeper than that, I would say there might be a difference between chaos on the one hand and order on the other. And yeah, I agree with Chris, though, that in reality, this historically became the progressive and conservative branches of capitalism. And I think, you know, another way of putting this, maybe not so usefully, would be to say left and right liberalism. You know, that conservatism So I think, and a lot of people have arrived at similar conclusions. By the way, I have a lot of respect for people who do genuine Marxist analysis. I just wish that there were more people doing it. I don't think there are very many Marxists left. And I think the vast majority of people who describe themselves as left-wing are not. And I think there's an extremely authoritarian strain in contemporary leftism, which people are not self-aware about at all. And because they think, because I'm a leftist, I must be good, and I couldn't possibly engage in any bad behavior. And that's simply not the case. So I think we have to be, as Chris is always, I think, careful about delineating what level, when, these different tendencies, and also saying there's a lot of people who use concepts incorrectly or inaccurately, let's say. So the contemporary left is not really the left, perhaps we might want to say in some ways.
Yeah, if I would add to that, you brought up equality and hierarchy, also order and chaos. Let me get to that later. What about freedom?
Yeah.
Right, so the left should be about more freedom.
Well.
Right, and the right is skeptical about freedom. Right?
I think, yeah. Can I just add? Yeah, I agree. I mean, freedom is a word that floats about all over the place historically, but I think, when we talk about liberty, I think for the ancients, really it meant being liberated from the shackles of desire, for example. It would be about getting your desires in order so that you weren't dominated by them, right? So liberty would be liberty from constraint in the sense of, weakness, natural weakness and things like that. Whereas I think freedom is such a nebulous term. I mean, it's obviously a very powerful term. Benjamin Studebaker, who I know you know, told me he was at the DNC with you guys, and that freedom kept flashing up on the Kamala Harris screen relentlessly. Joy, freedom, joy. I mean, this is scary, right? And then we can think about freedom fries and the whole ambiguity of that phrase that was used during the Iraq War. And, I mean, anyone can invoke freedom. I think it's a very powerful word. We all want to be free. We think we do. I think the people who are demanding, for example, liberal sexual freedoms, I have no qualms about being extremely punitive to people they believe oppose them. So it's freedom for who? I mean, I'm currently in the UK, which is undergoing a rather authoritarian leftist authoritarianism, or at least, Starmer is nominally Labour. I mean, he's, the extent to which he bears any relationship to the Labour movement is a completely other question, but he's a prosecutor general, and he's putting many people in prison for, social media posts and, I mean, really political imprisonment. So freedom, everybody wants freedom. What does Chris think? Freedom.
Let me say about this, this is actually something that I teach a great deal about philosophically. So ancient freedom, modern freedom. So ancient freedom, Aristotle defined freedom usefully as an ancient. Freedom to be, right? Freedom to be what one is meant to be. So if a tree grows unhampered, unhindered, then it is, realizing itself, it's realizing its nature, and that is its freedom. So freedom from constraint in that way, from external constraint, and the autonomy of a community, of course, right? The freedom of the polis to self-determination. Now, freedom like Moses, let my people go, which really means let my people be free to be themselves, to practice their religion, right? To not be in slavery. And the most important thing about not being in slavery was being able to practice one's religion, because of course they weren't against slavery at all. Once they reached the promised land, they had their own slaves. So modern freedom, however, is a quite new idea and a difficult concept. It's the freedom to change, to become, transform in an open-ended way, to realize potentials that are constantly being historically generated and that aren't just there by nature. Right. So, I don't know, Rousseau, society forces us to be free, which it very much does, meaning it's society that forces us to act against our instincts. and that's not a once and for all thing, but then develops historically. And, as a Marxist, I see this as the issue of capitalism is a self-imposed, historically specific form of unfreedom that we are tasked with freeing ourselves from. And then maybe after that, we'll discover that we've created a new unfreedom for ourselves that we have to overcome. Right? So I think it's hard for us to even conceptualize these things, which is why there's such a thing as the dialectic and the modern dialectic, not just Hegel, but Rousseau and Kant and others. Because it's really about change. It's really about transformation. It's really about that possibility. Now, I'll say one other thing about freedom, only because I'd be remiss. So that's like the philosophical. But what about the historical? So, I brought up the Jacobins, the left of the National Assembly, the more radical, the more democratic. However, the French Revolution is usually separated, opposed to the American Revolution. So I'm over here in the United States, Dave. And, many people, conservatives, liberals, progressives, conservatives, will say that the French Revolution emphasized equality, whereas the American Revolution emphasized liberty. And of course, what we have to remember is that in neither case were these opposed values. Neither for the American nor the French revolutionaries were liberty and equality opposed. And I think that it's interesting that we find ourselves with those values now opposed to each other. And I chalk that up to capitalism. I think that that's a real contradiction that has developed that wasn't there at first. That contradiction, apparently, that antinomy between liberty and equality wasn't there in the beginning. And I think, again, we have to challenge ourselves to think, well, how did they not think that these were opposed? Because now it seems like they're naturally opposed. And I would say, no, not necessarily. Anyway, Dave, it seems like you had something.
Clarifying question. So, I mean, it makes sense that, today the Democrats would care more about equality, and also the right likes to say equity, right? Whereas the right cares more about liberty, and often smaller government is part of that.
The Gadsden flag?
The what?
Gadsden flag.
Which one is the Gadsden flag?
That's the, it's not the
snake.
The snake.
Like,
okay.
No, I think is it the snake? I thought it was the tree. There are all these sort of ancient things. Ancient meaning.
Don't tread on me with the snake. Is that the
other
one?
it might be. I might be confusing them. I know Samuel Alito, the Supreme Court justice, his wife flew a flag, and people were like, "Oh, that's white supremacist flag."
Oh,
okay.
It's an American Revolutionary flag.
Okay,
right, but is it liberty?
The tree of liberty that needs to be watered with the blood of
tyrants and patriots? It may not be that tree. So okay. I don't know. I don't know my right-wing symbolism. I was staying outside of Milwaukee for the RNC, and we saw pirate flags that people were flying outside their homes. And it was like, is this code for something? Am I supposed to know what this means? Because it wasn't like a sports team logo, right? I was like, this means something, but I don't know what it is.
They want the booty.
Yeah, maybe. That would be good. Anyway.
But okay, the question though was about my understanding of the French versus American revolutions. The French Revolution included in it this very this element that was just outright anti the ruling class, there being a ruling class or a property owning class, having special rights over everyone else. Whereas the American Revolution, I thought that it was a revolution for property owners.
Well, wait. So late in the French Revolutionary process, after the fall of the Jacobins, there is Gracchus Babeuf, the conspiracy of equals, one of the originators of modern socialism, one of the key originators of modern socialism, yes, had a critique of property. However, Robespierre was fine with private property. And so I wouldn't say that it comes down to property. The French Revolution is all about property, but Depends on what we mean by property. So here I'll make reference to the English Revolution. There was an English Revolution. We might not know it, but there was. John Locke, right? The three inalienable rights: life, liberty, and property. But how did Locke understand the basis for property rights? It's actually the rights of labor, meaning something is your property if you worked on it. So he had in mind the land. So if you farm the land, it's yours, rather than an aristocratic title.
Right.
Right. So you can't take it by force. That's illegitimate. But if you work it, then it's legitimate. And that's not understood as natural. It's understood as a social right, meaning we respect the labor of others, and that's why we grant property rights.
Right.
So if we forget that, we forget a lot, right? So what property means, we can look at the capitalist world and we can feel immiserated and cut out and disempowered, and we can say, oh, it's the property owners. But we have to remember where those property rights come from, because, like, from a Marxist perspective, labor versus capital are two sets of property rights that have become opposed in capitalism, but that were not opposed originally, because the right of property was the right of labor. There wasn't a property and capital separate, right? So at least the revolutionaries thought so. Were they full of shit? Who knows? But this idea is there. So that's where I would say both the French and the American revolutions were in the name of property rights. But property rights, and you know why? Do you know why life, liberty, and property in the American Revolution was replaced by Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Because they were radicalized by the Enlightenment and by Rousseau, which came after Locke. And they said, well, property is a means to an end, not an end in itself. So you can't really have a right to property. You have a right to the pursuit of happiness, of which property might be one form, but we might no longer have property in the future. Unfortunately, in the capitalist era, in the industrial era in the United States, the Supreme Court reinterpreted pursuit of happiness to mean property.
Right, right.
So it kind of undid the radical contribution of the American revolutionaries to the Lockean principle.
And it will be on us to reinterpret it to include time energy. But for now, so
time energy means labor, right?
The condition for what becomes labor power, right? Yes.
Right.
So Nina, well, really quick, before I set up this question, I want to just give you a moment to respond to any of that you might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, reading the work of Etienne Balibar, I mean, he makes very clear this égalité, like, you know, the kind of fusion, the you know, the non-dissociability of this idea, in particularly the French Revolution. But yeah, I mean, and the idea of the citizen subject and so on. I mean, I think, you know, equality is a very powerful word. I mean, if you read Burke on the French Revolution, which is a very interesting book. I mean, I strongly recommend everyone read it. It's, you know, very early on, 1790, I think he you know, writes the reflections, and he says, he points out how powerful these abstractions are, you know, so equality, liberty, and fraternity. So basically, you know, you tell everyone that they're as good as everyone else, that they're free and they're all related. This is going to cause chaos. You know? You know, and I think that power of abstraction, you know, equality is like freedom, indeed, and that kind of connection, very, very, very powerful. You know, we might think about it. I mean, lots of post-liberals trace it back to a kind of, you know, how do I put it? A secularized Christian notion of equality before God, right? I mean, it clearly, but it's interesting, isn't it, that freedom originally in these documents is freedom to worship. You know, why did they leave England? You know, because they want to worship free. So, you know, when you speak to people in international development, they say, like, if there's a natural disaster, the first thing people want rebuilt is not the school or the hospital. It's like the mosque or the church. You know, so the freedom is freedom to worship. You know, at that particular moment, it's not freedom without constraint to eat 9,000 donuts and imagine that you are a Furby or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like it's not this kind of limitless idea, this fantasy of total transformation. And this is where I probably would be conservative in the sense, Christopher, like in a Lashian sense, right? I don't know how conservative that is really. It would be simply to say that we need to look at the history of progressivism and look at what it's modeled on. And he makes this point that it moves from being modeled on a religious idea of a kind of eschatological idea to a kind of scientific one in which there's no end, so that the kind of transgression of limits simply becomes its own machine, and that no one pays any attention to limits anymore. So it's like, well, this endless process of progress and becoming is whatever people want to make it, and that's what freedom is. That's what it sort of becomes. But of course, we're talking about capital and the constraints imposed there as well, right? So this is
limitless growth.
Yeah.
Limitless growth in capitalism is a form of unfreedom.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So that's the trick, is that in capitalism we're living in a dynamic form of unfreedom. Although we respond to it as if it's a static state of affairs, as if we're still revolting against a caste system. We're not. What we're revolting against is an unfree form of freedom. And that's again the tricky part. So the way that I usually teach this, being and becoming, the dialectic of being and becoming, transformation is continuity and change. Meaning it's not supposed to be entropic or just chaotic. It's supposed to be developmental. It's supposed to be, enlightening, maturing. It's not supposed to be the violation of nature. It's supposed to be the transformation of nature. It's not supposed to be the negation of it, right? It's supposed to be, can we have a new relation to nature that unlocks other possibilities? It's not supposed to be this like pure negation.
Why do we need a new relation to nature? What's wrong with the old one?
Well, what was the old one? The old one was a new one at one time, right? So humans have invented new relations to nature for 100,000 years.
So I've got a question for you both that I think relates directly to that. And I'm going to call on you each to speak as a woman and as a gay man, actually, because I think that'll be fun. That'll be fun and funny because you both kind of came of age in the 90s, right? Like you both, like the 90s were formative for you both. And each of you were at one point sort of a prized member of the demographic that the Democratic Party was catering to, but I don't know what was going on in England at the time. I'm a heathen, but I want to come back to that question though first. So in a minute, first I want to get to this one for you, Nina, to kind of bring it back to this idea of neither left nor right, and I want you both to have a moment to talk about this for sure. But starting with Nina, who has moved to Substack. Everybody, if you want to see what Nina's doing, you got to go to Substack. It's the best app in your app store. It's where it's all at. It's much better than X. It's much better than Threads. And of course, you can follow Nina. That's part of the reason. But one of these posts that you made, it starts with, "There's a perma helicopter over London now. The UK is now run by a prosecutor general, eliminating the last vestiges of any separation of powers." And this is kind of getting back to what you brought up. You alluded to it, but I want to give you a moment to talk more about it. But really, you kind of get to this point here. You say, anything you've written online, including private chats, will be fair game. If you arrest someone on a charge relating to national security, which is pretty much anything and anyone at this point, if they make extreme misogyny a crime, then any meme mocking roasties or whatever will be enough. Humor will be no defense. Hate speech at this point is basically noticing or commenting on anything at all, or exhibiting any curiosity or critical thinking whatsoever. All of this will be done in the name of protecting minorities, of course. But don't be afraid. Just be organized. This was a useful and comprehensive piece. But this is where we really get to it. Okay. So you say Starmer's government seems more obviously humorless, prosecutorial, left authoritarian, but the Cameron-Clegg coalition handled the 2010-2011 student protests and riots in a similar way, including threats to encrypted messaging services, 24/7 courts, and prison for Facebook posts. The COVID lockdowns and mass and explicit use of fear and emotion to manipulate the population were also a trial run for imprisoning everyone without legal process. Many things appear in the rearview mirror as practice runs, frankly. it is much more useful to see this in terms of elite people and authoritarian/anti-authoritarian rather than left/right or whatever. Most people don't want their private chats leaked or their jokes punished, and they would support online anonymity. But most people also don't want to lose their jobs or have their families threatened either. And so this part about how we might think about it as elite or authoritarian as opposed to a matter of left or right, and how it's almost like the parties are taking turns taking on this role of authoritarian or censor. I find that really interesting, and I was wondering if you'd like to expand on that in the context of this conversation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think maybe it goes back to the point about, progressive and conservative capitalism. And I think the whole kind of line about, if you're not prepared to talk about capitalism, don't talk about fascism, right? Like that, actually, whatever, this left-right thing is often a kind of illusion, and everyone gets caught up in voting for whoever, and but really we're talking about the Uniparty at the level of the policy. It's been the same for decades, right? And you just get different flavors of authoritarianism and different characters, but it doesn't really make any difference. Yeah, I mean, I think it's manifestly clear. I mean, it's interesting that lots of resources in early Marx, by the way, of course, about freedom of speech, and I gave a talk quite recently. People tried to cancel it, of course, but blah blah blah. Plus ça change. About left-wing attitudes towards free speech, and Marx is very useful here, actually. Not that you would know that from people who claim to be Marxists today. But in any case, so yes, I mean, I think it's manifestly clear that there is an elite group of people, regardless of whatever party they claim to be from, who are acting not in the interests of the people, or indeed in terms of anything they voted for in the last 30 or 40 years either. And then anytime anyone tries to talk about things like that, I hate to sound like a sort of boomer gammon or whatever, but people are shut down very quickly. As I'm proof of this, as many people have experienced various forms of economic social sanction for discussing various things they want to talk about. And it's a very chilling atmosphere. And I think the demonization of the working class is a huge part of this. I mean, Starmer has just basically declared that the whole of the white working class, or, anyone in the working class, whether they're white or mixed race or whatever, is basically a far right thug. By definition, the Home Office tweeted the other day preemptively that everyone arrested is a criminal, which goes dramatically against the idea of the presumption of innocence. They literally tweeted, these criminals will be punished, and we're talking about people who haven't been charged, who maybe would plead not guilty. I mean, you can't, this is total erosion of the separation of powers, which you might say is a kind of illusion anyway, but at least maintain the the illusion, right? Now we simply have a prosecutor, the courts. I mean, Starmer was head of the DPP, so he was overseeing all the prosecutions, by the way, also in 2010 and 2011. So he knows very well how this runs. There's no gap anymore between the government, the courts, the police, and the media, and the prisons. Everything is in lockstep, and this is very frightening, because there's no friction. That's a scary place to be. So yeah, I wonder if we will have a kind of popular revolt in some sense in Britain. I don't know.
So Chris, I want to hear kind of your just general thoughts on that, but specifically, I'll just put it bluntly. When we start talking about equality, we start talking about liberty, then we start going into history lessons, and we start talking about what left meant to Rosa versus what it meant to Robespierre versus what liberty meant to Aristotle. To me, it all just starts to, and I love my old books, but it starts to feel a little remote from what's going on, where the capitalist left versus right, the progressives and the conservatives seem to be just keep taking turns limiting our freedoms and setting that up in a way where it sets precedent, where they just they get to keep accelerating it in this sort of frictionless way, like Nina's talking about. So how are these terms useful? How is all this historical stuff from your vantage point, useful when this is where we're at?
All right, so there are two things that are in tension or in contradiction. So one I would clarify on authoritarianism. I see authoritarianism as a from below phenomenon rather than a top down phenomenon, meaning society is as authoritarian as people want it to be, or they need it to be. So that's really the second part of it, which is, why is society authoritarian? Is it because people have authoritarian psychology, they have bad authoritarian ideas? Like, what's the actual reason why we've sunk into a kind of authoritarianism that previous dystopian writers have warned us against, but we're doing it anyway? All right, so there must be a need for it that people assent to in some way, that people see as necessary in some way. And that's where I'd bring in a kind of old Marxist idea, false necessity. Meaning these things might be necessary to the social and political and economic order now, but it's a necessity that we have to overcome. Meaning we have to think about what the true sources of this authoritarianism are in order to overcome their compelling, seeming, apparent necessity, right? So that's that's the challenge. Now that in the socialist and communist movement and the Marxist movement, there's a division between authoritarian and libertarian socialists or communists, and authoritarian and libertarian Marxists. And again, I see that as a symptom of something. I don't think that just is the case. I think that's a symptom. And when I go back to the kind of original historical Marxism, what I find there in thinkers like Lenin is that they wouldn't fit either the authoritarian or the libertarian label that we have now. They don't quite conform to what we would expect. That sometimes seems like an anarchist, sometimes seems like a Stalinist totalitarian. And again, capitalism is a little bit like that, isn't it? It's a little bit anarchy, it's a little bit totalitarian. It's kind of got both aspects to it. So I think that kind of disintegration into, because authoritarianism is quite paradoxical. Like from a Freudian perspective, authoritarianism is quite paradoxical. Often people will reach for authority out of a desire for freedom, in fact. I feel like this is why we started out with like, okay, freedom is kind of a loaded term. What does it mean? It's kind of difficult to work with. And yet I think that we can kind of specify some things, like, when thinking about like the collective in society versus the individual in society. Why would we want to preserve the rights of minorities, the rights of individuals? As a society, why would we want to value those things? Because it used to be understood. One person can be wrong against everyone else. So they'll be overruled, they'll be outvoted. The majority will implement their will, but we reserve some rights to even the lone individual. Why? That was a social value that we did that as a community, as a society, where we basically said one person alone might be the key to a future freedom that we don't recognize and appreciate now. That's why we did it as a society. We said, you might be wrong against the majority today, but in the future, you'll be proven right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we don't want to just annihilate the dissenter. Right? So, but now we're there, right? Like we are there. We are a total annihilation of the dissenter, total annihilation of the dissenting thought. What's wrong with you? Why'd you even have that thought?
And so you see this as a symptom. What is your primary hypothesis as to the underlying cause of that symptom? Are you going to say it's just the it's production, it's the base, it's just it's the needs of the relations of production in the moment, or is it something more complicated than that?
It's more complicated because, of course, what the needs of the moment are in terms of capitalism are contradictory. So I think that it's, especially now, I guess, in the internet age or whatever, things can be very disruptive. So it's dangerous to say ivermectin might help you if you have COVID. Why? Because it will make people wear masks less, they'll fear COVID less, they'll treat it as an alternative to getting a vaccine or taking a course of antiviral medication by the same company that brought us the vaccine. So it's kind of like, no, you need to stamp that shit out immediately, right? Because it's too disruptive. Well, how disruptive was it really? Like, but it seems plausible. It seems like, it's like my experience going to the grocery store during the COVID pandemic, the jarring experience of seeing an old person not wearing a mask in the grocery store. And then you realize, oh, they might have a condition where wearing a mask is actually bad for them because they have a hard time breathing or something. Right? But it's jarring because it's like, why is this person breaking the rules? Right? There's a kind of a primitive psychology that comes into play. And then there had to be the other side of it, a kind of compassionate side, which is, I'm sure they'd be wearing the mask if they could, but maybe they can't because they have emphysema or something. They already have a problem getting enough oxygen, but again, just that kind of experience. Whereas there were people who yelled at me for not wearing a mask when I was outside taking my walk, from across the street. And they weren't threatened by me. There was no microbes going and killing them. They just didn't like me breaking the rules.
But isn't this also a problem of stupidity? I mean, also the stupidity of the people, the people who govern it. I'm not going to be told what to do by people who are stupid and wrong. Like, I very strongly object to being told what to do and think by people who are wrong. I mean,
I'm not sure I knew what was right and what was wrong. In other words,
okay, for example, let me give you a very clear example. Like, women in Britain have been arrested for tweeting things like human beings can't change sex, right? Or men can't become women. Like, women have been arrested, and police have come to their house and said, we're here to check your thinking. Seriously. Okay, it goes back to your point about the lone dissenter, right? Okay, if we no longer have a state in which incredibly stupid people who have access to the state's monopoly on violence are threatening people for stating things that were basically scientific consensus and religious consensus and social consensus and cosmic consensus and every other consensus for thousands of years, on the basis that these claims are going to offend someone. It could be a hypothetical someone at this point in the hate speech legislation, and we're saying that these people should be punished.
Might cause a kid to commit suicide as soon as they read that tweet.
Right, but nobody even does. I mean, this is the other thing. Like, there's all these hypothetical genocides. I mean, they're even making up genocide. I mean, this is like horrific. This is like a kind of I didn't imagine postmodernism would look like this. I thought it would be people being playful and having like 15 identities, online.
But that's in a world, right, where there are people who actually do, through social media, work on kids and tell them to kill themselves. Say you should kill yourself.
Right. Okay.
And then they do kill themselves, right? So it's like a short step from that to, if you say the wrong thing, you might increase the statistical number of suicides.
Right, but then we need to rethink, how we're looking after each other as a social and collective project, not give more power to like sociopaths and pathological people who get a hard on when they arrest
people. I would just say, again, maybe it's not psychology. Maybe people, maybe it is stupidity, but maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's that this is the least worst policy that they can adopt or something. Plausibly, like it seems like, there's also the problem of if you give people a mandate, if you give them a job, they'll find a way to do it. And so, I'm a big fan. I mean, talk about libertarianism. I'm a big fan of not putting people in positions where they have to find something to do with themselves, right? So I don't think there should be internet censors, because their job is going to be to find something to censor.
Right.
So they are going to find something to censor,
But-
and if can't find something to censor, they're going to make something up to censor.
Hello, beautiful listener. I see you. Just kidding. I can't. But I have to interrupt this just really quick to make my own advertisement, my very own, the one that says subscribing, liking, commenting. It actually makes a really big difference. So even if you're just on the free side, shout out to you. Thanks for doing it. Make sure to subscribe and all that. Especially people on the podcast, make sure to say something nice in the reviews. It actually really helps. And I need reviews on every platform, all right? Because I just hate to say it, it matters, I try not to chase the almighty algorithm, but also I don't want to have all of this beautiful content go to waste. And so I'm trying to walk a fine line between quality and quantity. And I come out way heavier on the side of quality, as you can obviously see we do here. But come on, let's push that subscribe button, let's smash that like button, teach the algorithm what you actually care about. All right. And then maybe it'll show it to other people. That's great. All right, let's get back to it.
Sure.
I think I want you each to maybe elaborate on your position for a moment here, and see if I'm wrong in how I first spell it out. It seems like we're talking about, censorship, authoritarianism, various kinds of limitation on freedom, and punishment, which also includes obviously both legal forms and then also this sort of cultural, this culture war form where people are going to harass. They're not even paid to do it. They're just going to dedicate themselves to harassing people on the internet, right?
Oh, but Dave, it's not harassment. It's holding people accountable.
Oh, my bad. Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
What,
In fact,
you don't want people held accountable?
I'm so accountable. I'm now bankrupt. That's how accountable I've been held. I'm
literally accounts. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've got forensic attorneys coming in and making sure that you don't have any books.
You said
that are
they didn't
over
take
a certain
your books.
value. Yeah.
You said that they didn't take your books, right?
They won't. They can't take my books. And I've realized if they do try, I'm going to rip the front cover off of every book to totally devalue them. So I can
so they can't be
read
sold.
them, but I can just. I trashed my laptop recently accidentally, but it did occur to me that I could basically slightly destroy everything I own, so that it would be even more worthless.
Perfect. All my stuff's already kind of trashed. Yeah. But okay, good. If this stuff is all symptomatic of something, one way of saying it is that the system and its sort of cohesion or continuance or whatever has certain kinds of needs, and that might be a cause that causes these symptoms. The other might just be like idiots, like bureaucratic idiocy.
I think it's wider than that. That's what I was trying to get at. So I think that, historically, I'll just invoke Karl Popper, the open society versus the closed society. The open society is a society of risk and danger, and the closed society is the search for safety. And, most societies throughout history have been closed, and the open society is a kind of rare, fragile thing, but valuable nonetheless, valuable as such. And so, what is the old adage? People, trade their freedom for safety and get neither. Right? Yeah. But maybe, they get a sense of safety. And again, people can make plausible arguments. I mean, everything's statistical now, by the way. Right. So all harm is statistical. And so there's some way in which someone saying the wrong thing, you can make a case looking at data for the harm that results, that ramifies from that. But again, I think that we do have a sense of living in a dangerous society, living in an out of control society. and that people then are frightened by that. They are untrusting. I mean, fraternity, solidarity, social solidarity is broken down pretty severely.
Yeah.
It hasn't broken down entirely, but it's broken down pretty severely. And we've also lived through, I teach social workers, therapists in a PhD program, and I was teaching throughout the lockdown. And, and I just said, look, aren't we experiencing a great challenge to our mental health on the basis of both our sense of physical safety, but also our sense of moral safety has been stripped from us. Right. So when you strip people of their illusion of safety, because it's an illusion, it's a necessary psychological illusion, the illusion of safety. But when you strip that from people, you bring out terror, and people respond to terror in terrifying ways. They enact it, in fact. When people are terrified, they tend to enact that terror that they're feeling. And that's real. I mean, we are, this society is terrifying for a lot of people in a very real, direct way. And so it shouldn't be surprising that they do terrifying things in response. Now, the scary people are the sublimated terror people, like the bureaucrats who have, like, I don't know, naturalized their terror and can mete it out in small doses, who don't go physically attacking people, but just, type on their keyboard and ruin someone's life. I don't know.
But I mean, look, a lot of the decisions that are being made during lockdown were very detrimental to safety and health, actually. I mean, and also now, like, to invoke anarcho-tyranny, I mean, we have a situation where the British government are basically releasing violent prisoners, literally, in order to make room for political prisoners. I mean, they're just doing that. So, I mean, they're sort of literally making things less safe, if you like, for the majority of people.
I formulated it that way for a reason, because I think that the lockdowns themselves made us feel unsafe. Also,
I just ignored them, but I mean, that's fine.
Could you? I thought the UK was pretty draconian. I thought, didn't they bring down a government because somebody had a party?
Yeah, but that was like internal politics. I mean, you could walk. I walked around for like 8 hours a day. I put on a theatre production during a lockdown. I mean, it was fine. The ruling class and the working class basically just do whatever they want, and it's the middle class who obey the rules, right?
Sure.
I mean, this is what happened.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, and I live in a really poor area. Nobody really obeyed the lockdowns where I lived.
Very few working class people were able to comply with stay at home because they were what gets called essential workers.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's true. Yeah, that's definitely true.
No, I mean, it was kind of bollocks, the whole thing. But I mean,
right.
Look, I don't know. Why don't we? I'm kind of interested in like other anti-capitalist positions. I think there are lots of right-wing and religious anti-capitalist positions. And I spoke at NatCon, this conference, like a couple of years ago, much to everyone's annoyance. But I actually talked about Marx and the social individual and how we're not really individuals, but we're relational and so on. But the interesting split among the audience was basically between the kind of free marketeers, pro-capitalist right, and the anti-capitalist right, who are anti-capitalist for various different reasons, either coming from a sort of position of Christianity or from a kind of post-liberal critique, which owes something to Catholic social theory, perhaps, but also kind of almost like a naturalistic kind of embodied anti-capitalism, like capitalism is destroying us and the family and our bodies, and I don't know how to put that. There's a kind of environmental anti-capitalism, which is sort of maybe neither left nor right as well, or both, or kind of is that a kind of non-political anti-capitalism. I'm kind of quite interested in what a non-political anti-capitalism would be.
I think the challenge here, for me, and why I'm not a neither left nor right person, is because I think, well, two definitions of the right. One would be opportunism, meaning doing what's apparently necessary or convenient, and compromising principle under exigent conditions. That would be one definition of the right. That's the Marxist right, right? So when the left accused the right in Marxism, they said they were opportunists. In other words, they were adapting to the status quo rather than rising to the task of changing it. There's that kind of right. Then, of course, there's the reactionary right, the capital R reactionary right. It's one of my pet peeves. Not the reactive right, because we all react to things, but reactionary meaning trying to turn back the historical clock. And now this is a complicated question because I don't think history is just linear. However, I do think that it's hopeless and destructive to try to turn back the historical clock. I do think that. I think that history has borne that out. And that I actually see a lot of the destructiveness of capitalism, especially at a political level, taking place at its reactionary dimension, meaning trying to maintain things requires a great deal of repression. Now, that doesn't mean that we just go with, again, the false necessity of capitalism in its limitless kind of runaway process. But we ought to be thinking about how to realize the potential for change. We live in a dynamic society in a less destructive way. And that does not have to mean trying to turn back the historical clock, right? So, I teach this summer. I taught Juliet Mitchell, Women, the Longest Revolution.
Yeah.
Old gem from the 60s, right? And she said, it's a wonderful text, and it's really it never gets old. My students are like, oh, this is great, and never read it before. Didn't seem to be too far out of date. And she said, like, look, socialists and communists, utopian socialists, communists in the 19th century called to abolish the family. And Marx and Engels were like, well, no, capitalism abolishes the family already.
Yeah.
And the point is not to abolish the family, but to proliferate new kinds of families, new kinds of kinship, new kinds of possibilities, to realize that. Now, of course, 2024, right? So we're like 200 years later, almost. Capitalism has proliferated new family forms. But again, Juliet Mitchell was there to say that this has been done still within a kind of monolithic framework, meaning it's a false plurality, a false diversity of forms that are actually still very much like, gay marriage is something that happened in my lifetime. And gay marriage, I'm married, it's great on the one hand. On the other hand, you have to get married to enjoy certain social benefits. So it's a constraint. Of course you can only get married to one person. So the conservatives were like, oh, gay marriage, does that mean that polygamy is next? It's like, well, why not, actually? Why not, really? Why not, if people want to? Right? So again, we live in a kind of paradoxical situation where the family is reduced to, as Marx said, the cash nexus. Why do people stay married? Usually out of economic need, or the economic needs of children, or some kind of bureaucratic imperative that you have to be married in order to enjoy certain social benefits. And so on the one hand, there's a need for people arranging their lives in new and different ways. There's a actual freeing possibility there. On the other hand, it tends to be shunted into a rather narrow framework, and then that's called freedom. So the DNC, right? Freedom. What does freedom mean? And we're not going back. It means we're going to maintain our LGBTQIA plus DEI critical race theory agenda because that's liberating. And no one even stops to think, is it liberating? And also, maybe it is, but only in the most narrow way possible, right? In the most miserly way possible, right? So again, I think that it's a challenge to our imagination to really feel tasked by the actual possibilities that society is generating and not say, okay, let's just go with that on the one hand, a kind of capitalist progressivism. On the other hand, a kind of conservative reaction, capital R reaction, that's like, oh no, we need to go back to when things made sense and people had values and life wasn't meaningless. You're gonna have to go back a long ways to get back to when life wasn't meaningless. You know, we're just talking about the Middle Ages. Like, when are we talking about here? You know, so, and there are these Catholic integralists running around, and I'm like, God bless. Good luck with that. You know, it's not like people weren't dealing with nihilism in the Middle Ages too, especially the theologians. So those are my caveats. Like, yes, there's the false freedom of capitalism. Yes, it's destructive. On the other hand, the answer is not go with the flow of capitalism or try to turn the historical clock back.
Okay. Now, I think it might be a good time then to kind of just like set you up here, Nina, for like, let's just say Nina has the floor for 3 to 5 minutes, however long you want to kind
Sorry,
of.
it took a while there. It was a
talk about
complex
that.
idea I had to get across.
No, it's good.
It
It's
is.
good. It's
Yeah.
good.
Oh, and I
Yeah,
want you both to be able to do that before. We'll see if we can even get to the other things before we have to close out. But I want at least you both can define your sort of statements when it comes to this issue in particular.
Yeah, I mean, well, let me posit a few things, maybe speculatively, if that's even allowed these days. Will I be pinned to everything I say from
Yeah.
in the worst possible way? But yeah, I mean, I wonder about this thing. Okay, you know, there is a human nature. Okay, yes, it may be, of course, it's changed by tool use and by the kind of economic system and so on. But I mean, I don't fundamentally think we are that different from human beings in Shakespeare's time, or you know, at the beginning of agriculture. In some ways, I think we suffer we have the same kinds of bodies. You know, there are two sexes. You know, we're basically like, we have a nature. You know, of course it plays out in different ways, and we can decide how we, you know, cope with the fact of our own embodiment and our own sexual orientation, whatever. And that's you know, we have the opportunity to do that. But I wonder if it's if I don't think nature is in itself reactionary. I think sometimes people talk about capital R reaction as if it's purely historical. And I think it's not only. I think there are people who are genuinely defending what they think is a better way of living in relation to our own nature, which is to say, unless we want to say nature itself is perhaps reactionary. I mean, I was asking someone the other day whether they thought that nature itself was dialectical, because I think this is a fundamental question. I think the nature kind of is what it is, right? Like, I think, you know, that actually it's better, certainly in my own experience of my own life, experientially, it has been better for me to come to terms with my own nature than it is for me to fight against it. Right. So then that includes genetic predisposition to alcoholism, this includes whatever, right? Like, it is much better for me to come to terms with being a woman, you know, having these flaws and these faults. And I think Christianity as a moral system and a form of belief and a practice is much, much, much better at doing this, actually, because it totally starts with you're broken, you know, you will make mistakes constantly, you will have to forgive others.
Forgiving it.
Yeah, you will have to forgive yourself and others constantly. You will have to apologize. You know, and it's actually very beautiful. Like, it actually does work, I think, as a kind of social technology. If we want to, I think it's much more than that, of course. But I think, you know, and when you miss out those bits, you end up with a kind of fanatical purity spiral, like good, bad, splitting, black and white, you know, craziness, which is like all of the worst aspects of Christianity. And of course, we could have a historical story about how we got here, and you know, the role of Christianity and all of that, and capitalism. But I kind of want to maybe like defend a sort of space, which is maybe, I don't know, am I going to sound just like really non-dialectical? I know it's not very cool to be non-dialectical, but but like, I think that there is a kind of nature that, okay, maybe, of course, it's always mediated. Of course, it's always, you know, we're always in relation to it, you know, and we have a second nature, you know, tool use and everything. But I think the people who get furthest away from that question, or the idea that there might be things like natural kinds in human beings, for example, are really partly doing the work of contemporary capitalism for it, right? And I think that contemporary capitalism makes a lot of money at the level of creating new demands and new desires, right?
Needs.
Of course,
Generating new needs.
Like, so, you know, okay, we can put this person on drugs for the rest of their life. You know, we can invent a pain where there wasn't a pain before, and here's a solution. And it turns out to be techno-scientific. You know, it's not a spiritual question or even a therapeutic question, despite the dominance of therapeutic language. You know, it's like, no, this can only be solved with drugs and surgery. And anyway, but I mean, okay, this is one minor aspect of capitalism, but it's definitely part of it.
It's a major one now.
Yeah, but it's, you know, let's say in terms of kind of capital flow and, you know, like we're talking about a system which is a kind of global system, right? Okay, of course there are various countries that are opposing it. There are different sort of, you know, forces at play, you know, whether we're gonna go down the China route or whether Russia's gonna sort of intervene or whether Islam is a very, very powerful force in some ways. I don't know, like I really have no idea, but I think, you know, we're talking about an increasingly frictionless system that is global in nature, not national. Anyone who starts to try and talk about a national politics is immediately shot down in any case. And so there is no basis in that sense to oppose this kind of global, I don't know, the global flows, which are not in anyone's best interest. They're not human, right? They're kind of, and I agree with kind of Nick Land almost in this way. Like what we're dealing with isn't human. It's like, of course it's not. It doesn't have our quite vulnerable needs at heart. Like it doesn't really deal with finitude or like the body or, you know, anything like that. It's a kind of crushing machine, and it destroys difference. It destroys, you know, like what Marx says in the Communist Manifesto. Like it really does do that. It chases to the corners of the globe. It crushes superstition and, you know, difference and all of those things. And yeah, okay, on the one hand, that's great. We get a kind of new human subject, a new kind of humanity, new types of collectivity and so on. But at the same time, like I do this question of limits and natural limits and like kind of better and worse ways of living, and you know, this system is making people incredibly ill, apart from anything else. Like it's a very unhealthy system at that level, and I think it's very interesting that RFK has joined Trump. Actually, whatever, who knows what's going to happen? No doubt Kamala will win on vibes or some absolute horror, because we live in a kind of psychosocial chaotic nightmare of, like, you know, emotionality or whatever, and they'll probably just steal the election anyway, and it doesn't really even matter particularly, but they definitely don't want Trump to win. But you know, that question of the health of the nation is quite interesting with RFK. But you know, and I think these things used to be a question for the left, and this is something that's definitely changed in my lifetime. I remember people on the left were very suspicious of like big pharma and bad food, and you know, they were very much on the kind of whole foods and homeopathy, and that was a left position. Now that's become like a sort of right-wing position somehow. Sure. I don't even think it is right-wing exactly. I mean, wanting to look after one's health and have a family, how can that be right wing? But whatever, it apparently is.
The parties have shifted. The parties have shifted.
Right.
So that's why these things are now coded differently. I mean, a lot of it's propaganda.
No, I mean it maybe doesn't matter, but it's I don't know how to.
Can I give an anecdote?
Yeah, go on.
All right. So I'm married to a Muslim who's a believer.
Mm-hmm.
And he's from Malaysia, he's an immigrant. And in Malaysia, they have sex police knocking on doors late at night of unmarried couples, heterosexual couples. They will arrest people. Neighbors will call on their neighbors and tattle on them and get them arrested. You know, so when I was dating Fazell, I asked him, you know, when I realized he was a believing Muslim, I said, is homosexuality a sin?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, it might be, but God forgives me. And that's all I needed to know, right? In other words, no doubt there are busybodies in Malaysia who persecute homosexuals. And, you know, but at the same time, there are, you know, Fazell has gay friends still back home and they live their lives. And so, you know, it would be nice if they didn't have laws against homosexuality and laws against non-married heterosexual sex and things like that. No, it's a Muslim country. There is a Muslim world. There really is a Muslim world. And it is, and of course they think that LGBTQIA stuff is Western capitalism, cultural imperialism, neocolonialism, and they resist it as such. At the same time, some people leave and they come to live in the United States for the freedom that they can have here that they can't have there. And so it's a very complex situation. So I feel like, okay, so, but what's the freedom that's really at stake? Like, in other words, those kinds of cultural things, what are you going to do? You're going to launch a crusade in Malaysia to convince Muslims that they should be more accepting of gay people? They're kind of accepting. I visited his family and, it was a no ask, don't tell situation, but they knew exactly what our relationship was. We had our wedding rings on, right? We just, they didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about it. I was his friend and they were so glad that he had a friend, and that we were sharing our lives together. So, it's, in the United States, like I live in a major city, Chicago, I live near the gay neighborhood. And, I know that there are repressed kids from the suburbs who discover their homosexuality and who want to march around in gay pride naked and defy their suburban conservative background and, épater la bourgeoisie, shock people. And, and I always joke about identity politics, that you wonder if people weren't whatever they are, black, gay, whatever, like if they woke up one day and a black person was white or a gay person was straight, what would they do with themselves? Because they make it their entire existence, like enacting this thing. And, but I think that, the thing with capitalism is that, what's the real unfreedom bearing down on my husband and on me? It's that he'll get laid off, that he'll be thrown out on the street. Like these sort of more impersonal forces that you can't like put a cultural attribute to, and that really don't care about any of that, right? Like actual societal things that are complex. And I feel like, well, okay, the way that system keeps going is to take all the pent up terror, frustration, fear, anger, and channel it in these cultural directions and provide like spurious cultural solutions that to my mind are pretty faddish.
Yep.
Like when I look at the last 200 years, I think, well, there have been these fads, and, religion has come and gone as a fad. Sometimes it's in, sometimes it's out. Right. And I can't help but think, okay, people in the neoliberal era and people right about now are finding religion again. And that's a historical symptom, meaning that wasn't the case like 20 years ago, 15 years ago. So what's going on right now? And that's not to, again, I actually think that the profound question, like theology, religion, existential questions, I actually think that, I'm not like anti-religion or something. I was asked at a panel recently, well, what about the bigotry that comes from religion? And I was like, yeah, I'm not so sure that it does come from religion, as opposed to any place else. Like bigotry comes from anything, any source, like, can be used to justify bigotry. I wouldn't lay it on religion. And that's why my anecdote was important, because I don't think, I mean, on the face of it, Islam is very conservative. Muslim countries are very conservative. But in reality, people are forgiving and accepting and people live their lives, So I hate the fact that it's turned into that, right? It's turned into a way that people can hate each other. Now, the other thing is he's on, Muslim Instagram or whatever. And so I see the like videos like from the young Muslim preachers who are out there proselytizing and who say, if you're gay, it's okay. Allah made you that way, but you need to resist your impulses. It's a hate the sin, not the sinner kind of message.
Yeah.
You should resist your impulses the way I, as a heterosexual man, resist my impulses to cheat on my wife.
Right.
And it's like, well, that sounds nice. But so there's just a lot of this out there, and I feel like I'm not gonna approach that head on. I'm not going to say, okay, well, that must be stopped. What kind of an evil message is that giving to people, struggling with their sexuality? So, I guess I'm for shifting the register of discussion of these things and thinking about what's real freedom, what's false freedom, like not just becoming anathema to these ideas because they can serve pernicious roles, right? So kind of, legitimate conservative values are used for pernicious roles. Legitimate progressive values are used for pernicious roles in capitalism.
Sure.
I'm worried about that. Like, in other words, what is it about our society that can make things liable to playing the pernicious role that they play?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with that. That's across the board. Things can be used that way. Can I ask you a direct question about a specific issue, Dave? Do you mind?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
How do you feel about surrogacy?
Surrogacy. Well, I mean, it's tricky, of course. Everything in capitalism is exploitative. At the same time, should the state criminalize such things or even excessively regulate them? I guess I'm a libertarian at heart, meaning I don't think narcotics are good, but I'm not for criminalizing them. I think there might be existential questions raised by things like abortion, but I don't think it should be criminalized. So it's one of these things I feel
which
like,
I take to be a different question than how I would like to ask Chris the same question. I'm going to slightly change it though. Well, because there's your opinion, Chris, but then there's also, for instance, a new socialist party. Should that be a make or break issue for it? Or wouldn't people in the working class be able to be divided on this issue and still be a part of some new movement?
Well, that's certainly true. That is definitely.
That's where I think we should always take it with a Marxist in a conversation, because I don't care what Marxists believe personally, so much as if they want some kind of a new movement or a party, it's like, well, what would be okay within it? And I want to, let me just really quick, because I was hoping I could get this in here at some point. And so this is probably the point. In one of our earliest conversations, I had asked you on this point about cultural conservatism and the working class having its conservative elements, not as people are conservative. Obviously it has that as well, but also human beings have conservative and liberal sort of different takes on different things, right? People are mixtures of these things. And I was bringing up, wouldn't a real party that actually is for a mass movement have people who are pro-life and pro-choice within the same movement, right? Wouldn't any real large-scale structural kind of change have to include people who are going to be split on issues like abortion? And you'd said yes, which is, I take to be a very unpopular position in what calls itself the socialist left.
It's confusing for people. So reproductive freedom is a complex question that can only be posed in a very distorting way under capitalism. Right. So I would say, Marxists historically, socialists historically, and I'm sympathetic, have been for reproductive freedom. And, not just negative, right, but positive. In other words, the point being that people should be able to biologically reproduce when they want to. We live in a society where children are expensive, where women have to make a choice between deferring childbearing till an advanced age when they need a lot of medical help to do so. And that's horrible, So, people are not free, really, to make choices, to be self-determining in that way. And so I feel like we should be very skeptical of the choices on offer under capitalism, because they already accept a very constrained framework in which these things are posed. So again, like surrogacy, like contract, it's like, well, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, well, but what are the social conditions? It's like prostitution. prostitution is like one of the more horrific forms of exploitation, but criminalization of it hasn't stopped it yet. In other words, we have like sex trafficking, human trafficking, slavery, rampant exploitation on scales probably never seen in the history of the world in terms of pure numbers, right? But we have a lot of laws against it. We have internet surveillance of it. We have massive state apparatuses to fight it. Hasn't worked yet, right? So I'd be more interested in, again, changing the conditions under which that happens, but also in the meantime, not punishing the victims.
I mean, I also don't think the elites actually do want to stop these things. Let's be clear. They don't want an end to the
Well, they don't really care.
institution
They don't
or
really
anything.
care.
They benefit from it. Let's also be clear. But I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering if Chris, because I, appreciate your historical account of the, the development of freedom and so on. But I'm kind of I have this strong feeling that there are things that lie outside of history that we might also need to recognize. And maybe this is a kind of ontological obstinacy on my part, that things like sexual difference are not purely the consequence or
They're not. Of course not.
and
right.
The fact that we are particular biological subjects comprised in particular ways, and however these things are articulated. And I'm wondering if a party, I'm all for a new socialist party. I was strongly behind the SDP in the UK. There weren't enough people to vote for, but like there are people who are, I think, combining, I would say, in a very vulgar way, economic leftism with a kind of social conservatism, or at least a kind of, a range of positions, right? Which is what we're talking about. Actually, how you're going to get people on board.
Compact magazine.
Well, yeah, well,
They were, yeah. I mean, so the gay gene. I've lived in the time of the gay gene, and I'm very hostile to the idea. Because I think that people probably arrive at homosexuality a number of ways. I've known a lot of gay people who were victims of sexual abuse, homosexual sexual abuse as children. And, so I think it's very complicated. And, I don't want my rights to my sexual freedom to one day be subject to a DNA test to see if I'm legitimately gay or not.
Sure.
Okay. So, right. So there's that, but that seems like what you needed in the United States to get homosexuality decriminalized. You needed a legal argument to be made that people by nature can't help what they are. And I feel like nature there, what is nature? You can't undo your biology. You can't undo your personal history. You can't undo your childhood either. Like in terms of accepting yourself, you have to accept things that were contingent, that were accidental, that happened to you, that you can't undo. Right. So again, I think that, people try to negate the past. And I also, I do have a radical Hegelian notion of nature, which is that it's not only physical and biological, it's historical and cultural.
Yeah.
Right. It's everything that has come into being, because after all, nature is not a static thing at all,
I just want to insert, it is his birthday today, by the way, so everybody shout out to
Hegel. It is
Hegel.
I'm not a Facebook friend of Hegel's, but somehow I still surmised that it was Hegel's birthday. It came through my feed. That's true, and all honor to that. But it wasn't just Hegel, right? The Kant and Rousseau, there is a more fundamental kind of recognition. We have to deal with the world as it is, as it's come to us, as we inherit it, what we're born into. And again, how we relate to that is what matters. You can't negate the past. You can't undo it. You can't change it in that way, but we can change how it plays out. We can change
Chris,
what it means.
But Chris, it feels like, and Nina, correct me if I'm wrong, part of the question, things being outside of history and immutable or natural and having to contend with that would also just be basic things. Like I think Marx would agree with this one, that, the earth, it's soil. so there's certain rules to what makes something soil as opposed to dirt. Dirt is dust and has no real value except its potential. Like you could cultivate it, it could become soil, it could become the condition of rich life, right? It could become teeming with life.
We've lived through the Green Revolution. We've lived through the third agricultural revolution. The first one was 12,000 years ago. The second one was 16th century England. We lived through the third one. We make the soil now.
But soil is soil, right? But soil is still soil. And if your food is coming from dirt with imported fossil fuel fertilizers and then it's just empty corn, there's no actual nutritional content there, it's just not actually great for you. But if you're bougie as fuck and you're alive today, you get to order your food like or someone
directly from the Andean mountains in South America.
Yeah, and it comes from one of the few remaining places with actual soil remaining, right?
Delivered to you directly. The future is now.
But taking that metaphor of soil, like humans also need to be cultivated. We need conditions for a life, and so human forms might change, human families might change, but there are also certain things about us that are still true today as they were in all times.
That's why I'll stick to what I was saying, which is basic point. Capitalism has been incredibly destructive. But we can't turn the clock back on it.
But how do you decide which aspects of things that have changed are because the clock has moved forward? How do you separate what is...
You're not going to restore the natural soil before there were processed fossil fuels used as fertilizer. You can't. It's gone.
No, but there are ways of farming that are not
no, but the damage has been done. The rainforest has been cleared. Things have happened. Humans have been changing the environment for thousands of years. And so,
but it's different to go back to a time
before it
was touched, and there's and actually just
we
changing how
better decisions going forward. We need to make better decisions going forward for sure.
Okay, that's what we're looking for.
I'm the last person who's going to deny the destructiveness of capitalism, but we have to hold two contradictory thoughts in our heads. We got to get off this destructive train of capitalism. We do. But we're also not turning the clock back on history. Both of those things are true.
Do you not think history can make wrong turns and that actually we learn from our mistakes and that we can kind of go, that was not a good idea. Maybe we should stop doing X and Y. I mean, clearly we do that on very local levels with like drugs that cause harm, for example.
Yes. Oh, no, I'm not saying, look, don't get me wrong. But, however, yes, we can. It's like what I mentioned about religion. I'll bring in Gadamer. You can't be a strict traditionalist because you're always reinventing the tradition. And so it's about the relation between the past and the present. The past is moving because the present is moving. And so we can change our relationship to the past. We can change the past as a resource for us. We don't have to liquidate all of human cultural history. We don't, but we do need to change relationship to it. So I don't think the future is some kind of like scientism, atheism, something or other. No, it's not. First of all, that's never going to happen. But even if it could happen, it shouldn't happen. So what are we going to have is a changed relationship to the past. And that's where I feel like, like the fundamentalists I mentioned, my husband watching his Instagram from the Muslim world and these young Muslim preachers, living in Europe, speaking with an English accent. They might be your next door neighbor, right? And it's like that Islam is not the Islam of 300 years ago. It's not the Islam of 50 years ago that they're preaching. It's gone. Right? So the question is, what are we going to do with it moving forward? And I'm not for negating it. I'm not for just destroying, right? Like, I'm not for like scapegoating, right? Like, in other words, like cisgendered, heteronormative, like, I'm in the gay community. I hate like the anti-straight people. Like, they've always been there. They refer contemptuously to the breeders. I've always hated that shit.
It's a bit counterproductive because then there'd be no more gay people if there weren't breeders. So, there'd be no more anyone. Right. So it doesn't make sense to hate people who have children.
the fact
No,
that
it's okay as long as they're surrogates, though, right? As long as they're being paid for it and they don't get to have good family lives, then it's okay, right?
I mean, look, there was radical feminism. There was like
still radical feminism.
Yeah, there was radical feminist science fiction where it was like maybe the future is parthenogenesis. And I've just gamed it out in my head. Like I'm like, I'm not so attached to X, Y, and penises. Like if freedom means that it should be a parthenogenic future of Lesbos, go for it. I don't think that's going to happen. And also, I don't think that would get rid of oppression because women on women can be quite oppressive, right? So I don't think like exterminating the male of the species is the answer to women's liberation.
No.
But right. And not because there won't be any children in the future, because maybe there will be, but I just don't think that's the answer, right? So again, we're given false alternatives of going back or keeping things the same or negating everything that we find problematic. This is a false choice. Because we can't preserve or negate, we have to transform. We have to do both. Right,
but I wonder if there are things that are kind of transhistorical or kind of underlie, like anthropological truths. I mean, when we talk about like accumulated wisdom and, if we're thinking about the Bible and things, the applicability of things. Yes, of course, we transform the past by reading things in the present, and interpretation is always like a moving feast. And
I don't want to burn the Bible, and I don't want to get rid of all the hundreds or thousands of years of exegetical interpretation of it either. I want to preserve all of that. I want to preserve history.
But I wonder if there are things that are less changeable than we might think in some ways, that are more, okay, of course they play out differently with different technologies and different periods and different places, but really, I mean, I'm very attracted to kind of theological and anthropological theories, like by people like René Girard, for example, who thinks about everything in terms of like envy and desire. Like these are very, very fundamental categories of human like existence, and they play out in all kinds of different ways.
Envy.
Right? Yeah, like envy and desire, like the fact that we are mimetic, we copy each other, that we become rivalrous because we compete for the same things. That envy is a very painful feeling we've all experienced. Like I remember feeling sexual jealousy. And it's one of the worst.
Let's not naturalize our narcissism. In other words, you could envy something and take it as a love object. That could be the solution. In other words, you could love rather than hate. In other words,
Sure. I'm not saying there's a way in which people can do it. It's more just the level we're talking about. I suppose it's like this very, very deep, profound anthropological way of
I just would be skeptical of that. I think that the human nature that we think that we see is a projection of the present. And is
but where does it come from? Like
biased.
We have a nature. There'd be no discussion if there was no basis, no material basis, no biological basis.
There is. I would just say you want to get very let's be very philosophical for a moment.
Please.
There are different temporalities.
Okay.
So there's the temporality of society, and there's the temporality of genetic evolution.
Mm-hmm.
We're living in coexisting temporalities. Right. And so I'm not going to deny that there's a enduring temporality of Homo sapiens as a biological species, where we're not going to see physical evolution of the species on the same time frame as we see radical changes in capitalist practices that drastically affect our ability to live on a day-to-day level and what we need to live on a day-to-day level. That we need advanced antibiotics to survive as a species now. We're not turning back that clock. We're not, So now, should we invent better antibiotics? Yes. But we're just not going to go back to when people lived without antibiotics. That's just not going to happen. Because we've become dependent on these things.
No one's proposing that we do, though.
Well, but for instance, right? So, and I don't want to put it on technology because, again, like that ends up being like one-dimensional. I don't think of technology as either being the curse or the answer. I think that it is a expression of our relations, and we have to have a more qualitative attitude towards these things rather than a quantitative one. And I think capitalism brings out a more quantitative performance
Sure.
dimension to things. And we are living in an accelerating world. That's part of the unfreedom of capitalism. And it does seem to be consuming and outstripping all pre-existing temporalities in a very destructive way. And I acknowledge that. However, we're supporting 8+ billion people, soon it will be 10 billion people in capitalism. These artificial needs that have been created are real needs now. For better or for worse, for good or for evil, right? So I like to use a Nietzsche expression. It's beyond good and evil. It's beyond good and evil. That's the reality. Now we still have to deal with it. That's up to us. But we inherit that from history too. We don't only inherit pre-capitalist history, including the history of the species, biology. We inherit all those things. We have to relate freely to these things and not destroy things that are our resources, are our basis.
But on what basis do we have any values whatsoever? I mean, if
we have to figure it out. We're without a safety net. We're free.
Right, but we
dangerous.
have accumulated wisdom of
Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's more or less useful.
I think I think
Yeah.
it's not going to be fair here because of the time constraints, and I want to move towards closing out. I would like to have some time to think more about this sort of question or tension in particular, and maybe come back to it in the future. Everybody who's listening to this on podcast as well as on YouTube, go ahead and do share your thoughts about it, because we'll hopefully be able to do a follow-up in the near future. Now, for the time being, we'll just kind of set it aside. And of course, in your closing statements, you can touch back on it if you want to. But I would also like you in your closing statements to bring it back to this question of neither left nor right. And so, Chris, I'm going to have you actually just go first right now, and then Nina, you'll have the floor to close out. And we're just about at time right now, so we'll do this right now. So,
all right. So, the nihilism of capitalism is not a mistake. It's a task. It's a real task that humanity has given itself, more or less consciously, maybe to a great deal unconsciously. But I think that the key, again, it's going to be another Nietzschean idea. What goes beyond nihilism, right? In other words, not pulling ourselves back from the brink of nihilism, but in, through, and beyond nihilism. If capitalism is a nihilistic reality we've created for ourselves, that we can't undo that situation we've created for ourselves, we can only try to overcome it. That's the task. In other words, it's not like just a bad thing. Like, it's easy to say there are all sorts of bad things going on in the world. We do have to think about our overall social historical situation as a society. We are united as a species now, our fate. And we're united in this bad situation, capitalism, and its nihilism. Now, there isn't just simply one answer to that. However, there's still one problem, right? There's still a fundamental problem. And, I don't think that the people, in Gaza are resisting global capitalism and are leading the vanguard of fighting global. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to, that Hamas is going to overthrow Israel and that's going to free the world of capitalism. But I talked to some students, earnest young people, sincerely want a better world. And they thought this is the key. No, I don't think so. So what are they reacting to? They're reacting to the nihilism of capitalism. They see it symbolized in various ways. And they embrace reactionary movements. Right? Ilan Pappé, important critic of Zionism, he said the difference between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Palestinians still grow their ancient herbs, and the Israelis eat GMO food at the supermarket. And so we should defend the Palestinians because they know how to grow herbs and the Israelis only know how to concoct things in laboratories. That's not the answer. It isn't. Only because the juggernaut of history is just too powerful for that. It's way too powerful for that. So for me, the left is not about good and bad values. It's not about good and evil. It's not about virtues. It is about history, and it's about what do we do with our historical situation that we inherit from the past and that we have to bring into a better future. We can't reverse course. We can't step outside the stream. We're in it. And for me, that's what the left means. It doesn't mean succumbing, adapting to the false necessity of capitalism. And that would include, like, look, the history of the left in the 20th century, like the Soviet Union. You know, they just took Western technology, capitalist technology, and put it on steroids and destroyed the environment. And, you know, that's not good. You know, we don't have good models for how to do this. But we do have this task that reappears in various forms, and different thinkers, different traditions have encountered this problem and have addressed it. And like, you know, religious fundamentalism is an answer. It is an answer. I don't think it is a good answer because I think it's too localistic. I think it's too communitarian. I think it doesn't get at the global situation that we're all in. I mean, we're living through, you know, a mass migration of the global middle class to Europe and the United States. You know, we are seeing like total depletion of the third world. It's just going to be some rich kleptocrats and some poor stranded people. You know, we really do have a political task that we're facing in coming years, decades. It's real. And I think that it helps to think of it as capitalism rather than to think of it as loss of traditional values or something like that.
Thanks, Chris. What would you like to say that in close, Nina? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, some concluding remarks. I mean, neither left nor right. I mean, I think fundamentally I would like to defend something that is outside of politics insofar as that's possible. I hate the politicization of everything. I think it's been extremely destructive for social life. It's polarized people. I don't even think it's politics exactly, but it's like the kind of phantom of politics. It's driven everyone mad. It's taken on the quality of like an ersatz religion. People have become demented and fanatical and puritanical. And so I suppose I would like to defend the at least the method and the promise of something like philosophy and you know, the quest for truth and curiosity and these kinds of things which go beyond politics or you know, maybe have something to say about political theory and whatnot, but are actually kind of deeper forms of relating. Because I think there's been very little dialogue between opposing voices and in that sense, I have said before that I don't really think the right exists in a certain way, which is a strange thing to say, but I think what I mean by that is that there is the sort of the dominant ideology, and then there are people who oppose it for all kinds of different reasons, for religious reasons, I don't know, scientific reasons, whatever. But and then they all get kind of dismissed as right wing, and this is cannot possibly be true, you know. And I mean, as someone who's been repeatedly described as far right, I mean, I know that this isn't true, right? Whatever that means, I'm pretty sure I'm not that, you know. And but at the same time I would say, well, let's have a conversation between all of these different positions. And I am very, you know, sure, if there are people who hold to very hardcore, very hierarchical positions that require some sort of corporatist, militarist nationalism, let's talk to people. Like, let's talk to these people. Like, you know, I do feel like there are some views that and positions that I would find very hard to give up, right? And I don't want to give them up, and I will argue with anyone about what they are. And I think that's important. And I know these are sort of liberal values, and you know, maybe this whole idea of dialogue is sort of disappearing in this kind of technocratic horror. authoritarianism, but I think we should resist that, like it very much in the local level and everywhere else and online and so on. So I do think there are battles to be won. I don't want to end up in this kind of doom pill, black pill, it's inevitable, this is the next phase of some authoritarianism. So I very much respect Chris's idea of what I understand by a new socialist party, and I listened to you speak with the Swoletariat man, don't know who he is, but yesterday
Amen.
Amen, right. And and you were talking about this, and and he's coming from somebody who's been an organizer, and I would like to see something like a very broad-based movement that didn't punish people for disagreements. And I don't know how my own personal experience is much like anyone else's, I suppose. Like the factionalism seems to be endemic to whatever the left is, and you talked about this too. And I don't know why that is. Why can't we have a party, as Dave said, that maybe has people who are pro-life and pro-choice, or people who are like sexual difference is real and immutable, and others who are like, no, but I feel like I'm going to change my sex, or whatever. It seems very difficult to hold all of these positions together, almost again like a quasi-religious war, like the war between people who are committed to transubstantiation and consubstantiation. Like there's something very repetitious about the divisive and real divisions. These are real disagreements. They are not just symptoms. These are real profound disagreements, and they're felt in that way. And I don't know how we sort of deal with that, but I would like to understand how we could. And I think I'm interested in almost like an anti-politics, I guess. And I think people who want to research questions that are deemed incompatible with the current liberal ideology should not be punished for doing so. And I don't know how we keep that open. And I do think there is a Marxist case, as I've made elsewhere, for free speech. And Marx defends these values completely, right? And also the freedom of journalism and so on against the Prussian state. And this is where he begins, really. And I would love to see more Marxists speak up for, I don't know, the right of people to work on like race realism, the right of people to say like, I don't know, really unpalatable, unpleasant things in transgressive and obscene ways, and that people should not go to prison for posting memes or saying things that they, I don't know.
Crime.
Right, like I would love to see Marxists defending, like the working class, all the people who just got shoved in prison. Neither the anarchists nor the Marxist left defended these people, even though they supposedly hate the state, and they hate the repressive state apparatus. Nobody said, "Oh, hang on a minute, we're putting the working class in prison." I think Anton Jaeger maybe was the only person who wrote something, or at least tried to give a class analysis of the recent unrest, because a lot of it took place in the most deprived, like you could map it, as you say, statistically, right? These are the poorest parts of the country. This is where there was unrest, and he tried to do that. And apparently he got a lot of pushback for even raising the question of class and economics and saying that this had anything to do with it. No, these people are just bad. They have bad views. They, it's good they're in prison.
That's a class position.
What do you mean?
That these people are bad. That's called a ruling class position.
Right.
Right. So they, the like not having a class position means you have the ruling class position.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, try telling these people that they think they're on the side of the oppressed or something. They think they're like good and victimy, and
Adolf Reed taught me this a long time ago.
Yeah. No, it's good. I like it. I think that's a good analysis. Yeah. So, I mean, that's not very conclusive, but there's...
You want freedom?
Yeah, sure. Like, freedom to talk about things and dialogue and disagree.
Freedom of religion is a basic thing. It's almost like we have to rediscover bourgeois society. Where'd this freedom come from? Came from the fact that millions of people were killed in religious wars, and they were like, yeah, maybe we should stop that. I mean, literally millions, depopulated whole countries through religious wars. And
but now we're going to kill each other over, I don't know, like really stupid stuff. I mean, were human beings always this stupid? Like, this is my question.
No, but they're terrified. they're terrified and they have capabilities for destructiveness that they didn't have before.
Well, whether you are actively involved in local or global forms of resistance to these tendencies that you're both talking about, or if you are just asserting the right and practicing it to speak about these matters and to hold space for disagreement or to associate with other people who you might disagree with. Thank you. Right. I think you're both doing that in your own ways. And we're going to keep on doing it. And, maybe it's not radical. Maybe it's not revolutionary. Maybe it's not even a real form of resistance, but it is something human in us that we can foster and that we can stay in touch with. And so thank you for being here and participating in it.
So thanks a lot, Dave.
Thank you
this
for
is great.
inviting us. Thanks, Dave.
Good to meet you, Nina.
Yes, it's very nice to meet you, Chris. It was delightful.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of letting others read and think on their behalf, slipstreaming our way into an understanding of a situation that short-circuits the deadlocks of our moment.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. What that has meant in the last year is traveling across the United States, into Canada, and then all over Europe to promote our books, courses, and ideas related to time energy and underground theory. You've been reading Underground Theory.
I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working-class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Time Energy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first I had to get freed from wage labor, which was achieved this year. That's right. Thanks to my monthly seminar subscribers, I was able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. Now I'm announcing the next big phase of the plan, which is the Mikey Down seminar. What monthly subscribers to the Mikey seminar are paying for is a survey of philosophy, including deep dives into Žižek, Land, Lacan, Baudrillard, Bataille, Lyotard, and ultimately the whole history of philosophy.
We're trying to build like this ongoing seminar, right? And that's what I really like about this thing, where, you know, if I'm teaching a main text, that's something I got to focus on. I got to really, but the seminar thing, we can do this stuff all the time where we dive deeper into concepts, we dive deeper into certain, you know, sections of books or whatever, and we can really do this nuanced stuff.
I think that there's probably no better way for us to accelerate our learning in these areas than by slipstreaming Mikey. And that has been my belief for years and years and years now. It's official. You're able to help out. You're able to get involved. You're able to benefit directly from liberating him from wage labor. Get on it right now. Do it. Just go. Stop what you're doing. Go click the button, subscribe. This is what you do. Subscribe to him. If you're already signed up for the ongoing Theory Underground seminars, then that's the ones that I do with my wife, Anne. Though that's getting an upgrade, which means that I will be doing one session per month that is just me, and then I will also be doing the ones with Anne, which are a crash course in sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, and ultimately Marx, Heidegger, Levinas, Bourdieu, imminently critiquing pop psychology, sociology, self-help, and ultimately the doxa of our time. But if you would like to be a subscriber to both Mikey's seminar and the seminar that the Snellgrove McKerrachers are doing, then the best way is to become a Tier 4 subscriber, or you can be a Tier 2 subscriber to each of us. The reason this matters is because Tier 2 is like pretty much the best bang for your buck. It gives you huge discounts on all of the courses that we do. But if you can't afford it, Tier 4 is amazing because it gives you Tier 3 access at both Mikey's seminar and ours.
And finally, not everybody has time to be part of these ongoing research seminars, and they just want to fund the paid content for the YouTube and podcast. And so thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon. They're the ones funding all the free stuff. So big thank you to Bert, Marilyn, Carl, Sahil, Zozandra, Nikolai, Darian, Tyler, and Mandeep, and all the other wonderful patron people, Patreon people. And thank you to all the other wonderful Patreon people. Thank you so much to all of you patrons, and also to the special subscribers and the paying subscribers. Oh my god, it's just so awkward. Thank you, Patreon. Patrons. Thank you. Okay. And to all the other wonderful patrons. Thank you so much, all you patrons. And also a special thanks to the subscribers on the YouTube side, as well as the paying subscribers over at Substack. Why can't we do this? God, you guys, just thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making this bullshit possible. Thank you to the subscribers. You did so good. Thanks, guys.